irrefutable proof that we're living in the last days. Welcome to the Summercast.
Welcome to the Summercast, a podcast aimed at making fundamentalism great again by applying confessional Baptist doctrine to all of life.
The last days. What are the last days? Are we in the last days? What's going on here? We have the COVID-19, we have the crash of the economy, we have government overreach, we have globalization. It must be the end of the world as we know it. Of course, that's what we might say if we were reading the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. But what I want to do here is I wanted to come on and try to add some perspective to this conversation, because usually when a traumatic event happens to society, like what's going on here, and there's multiple events, right, that's happening here. There's government overreach on the one hand, there's a virus on the other, there's economic collapse as a result of the government overreach. So you have a lot going on that is causing a lot of discussion on eschatology right now, obviously, for obvious, understandable reasons. People are starting to talk about that. And the church historically has talked about that whenever something like this happens. In fact, during the fall of Rome, of course, Augustine lived during that time, and Augustine is also known as the father of amillennialism. So when a lot of historians will often attribute amillennialism to Augustine, but really a shift in the church's understanding of eschatology has more to do with what was going on in the world at the time. And not just because one man decided to understand the scriptures differently than had been in the past. I would also question whether or not the amillennial position was original to Augustine, but that's neither here nor there. What I want to do is say that throughout the history of the church, anytime something like this happens, the church backs up and begins to ask herself, what's going on? Is our eschatology correct? Now, let me encourage everyone, and I'm just going to parrot things great theologians have already said. This is not original to me. We need to take the scriptures as authoritative and as sufficient for all of our faith and life. And so just because something happens like this, if your first reaction to something happening like this in society, in world news, in global politics, in national politics, in local politics, if your first response is, I need to reevaluate my eschatology, then your eschatology was never grounded in the exegesis of the scriptures. You see what I mean? Because if you are formulating a biblical doctrine by virtue of current events, you no longer have a biblical doctrine, do you? You have a doctrine that is subjectively interpreted from the current events. So if eschatology is a biblical doctrine and it derives from biblical theology, which I believe it does, then your eschatology should be formulated according to the scriptures and according to the scriptures alone. Nowhere in really church history, in theology, in hermeneutical philosophy, are we told that current events can be used as a tool for biblical interpretation. I think that's very dangerous. When you start to use current events as a tool for biblical interpretation, one, if you're a cessationist, you're not consistent. You're not consistent. Number two, you could end up in La La Land. Anyway, what I want to talk about here is actually proof, as I mentioned at the very beginning, that indeed we are living in the last days. So if COVID-19 is causing you to look for the advent of the last days or the coming of the last days, you might be a little bit disappointed, because it appears from the text that we've been in the last days. As a matter of fact, I'm preaching from Hebrews this coming Sunday, and Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 through 2. We're just now starting, did the introduction last week, going to actually jump into the text itself this week. And what I found is a very explicit, very clear statement that tells us that we are indeed in the last days. So if I could just bring up, let's see if I could bring up my my logos here for you, show it to you all. Let me make that a little, oops, don't want to do that. Maybe make this a little smaller. There we go. Okay, so what's going on here? First, we have God. Obviously, that's a reference to God the Father because of the information we receive in verse 2. So we have God the Father who, at various times and in various ways, okay, already you have many, this concept of many times, many ways, different times, different ways, spoke, right? So in other words, his revelation in times past, it's the Old Testament revelation, to the fathers by the prophets. So more than one prophet. This, in fact, it's in the plural. So we have more than one prophet. God is revealing himself through multimedia, quite literally, a multiplicity of media in the Old Testament. Now, you get to verse 2, and he says, has in these last days spoken to us by his Son. Now, the contrast here is obviously from the many to the one, right? And so God has revealed himself through the many. It's another way of saying through an imperfect medium. And it's not as if God was making a mistake in doing that or anything like that, but it was intended to be that way. Types and shadows and all that. So God is revealing himself through many, which is imperfect by definition. And in these last days, he reveals himself through the one, that is his Son, whom he has appointed heir of all things, through whom also he made the worlds. Now, the main point here in verses 1 and 2, is the contrast between what has gone on in the Old Covenant and what is now going on in the New Covenant. So the contrast is between different modes, if you will, of revelation, and also between different periods of times, different epochs, if you will, the Old Covenant period and now the New Covenant period. Hence the division in the Scriptures, the Old and New Testaments, right? But in verse 2, it introduces this new revelation of God by saying that this new revelation of God is happening in these last days. Okay. Now, you might say, well, that's just an expression. He's just referring to these later days, these later days, you know. The author is obviously writing after the finished work of Christ, and so he's writing in these most recent days. Is that what this expression means? Has in these most recent days spoken to us by his Son? Well, that's plausible. I mean, that sounds right. And it would be accurate. That would be true. It is, from the author's perspective, in these most recent days, God has spoken to us by his Son. Now, what I want to point out here is that these last days is not to be taken, although it's true that God has in these recent days spoken to us through his Son, or in his Son, but it's actually more than that, because here in verse 2 we have the word last, and that's the word eschatos, okay? Eschatos, from which we get our English word eschatology, obviously. Now, what does that mean? Maybe I'm just splitting hairs. Maybe it's a word that can be used equivocally, right? Maybe it could be used to refer to the end of the world, but it can also be used to refer to the most recent times. I don't know, maybe. No, it can't. The word for last days, eschatos, is used to signify the finality, right? Finality, in fact, I'll pull it up here. I don't know if you can see that. Do your best. I apologize for the size. The last, the final, at the end, till the end, right? So here you have, in these end times, you might be able to say, in these end days, these final days, right? It's not the most recent days, has in these final days spoken to us by his Son, has in these eschatological days spoken to us by his Son. Now, the interesting thing here also, I'll point this out, it's not too relevant to our discussion, but in verse 2, he says, has in these last days spoken to us by his Son. The best rendering, per A.W. Pink and some others, is that it's in these last days that he's spoken to us in Son, right? The word his is not there in the Greek. It's not, there's no article or anything like that, so it's in he's spoken to us in Son. Now, some would say, well, that creates a very awkward translation. Has in these last days spoken to us in Son. Well, you wouldn't say that if it said he's in these last days spoken to us in Latin or in Spanish or in English, right? That's an expression of speech that we use to describe the mode of communication that someone is using, right? And that is what God, through, I believe to be the Apostle Paul, here in Hebrews is doing. He is saying that he has spoken to us in Son, in the language of Son, or in the mode of Son. And when I say mode, I obviously don't mean modalism, but I'm just saying in the way God is revealing to himself to us. He is doing that now through his Son. So that's interesting. The first two verses of Hebrews are chock full of doctrine. So now that we can see that we are in the last days, these last days, right? The author of Hebrews sure thought he was in the last days, right? To the author of Hebrews, the last days wasn't something that was totally future. He's saying that he's in the last days. It's in these last days that God has spoken to us in his Son, whom he's appointed heir of all things, through whom also he made the worlds. And I think throughout Hebrews, you get up to Hebrews 12, right? And you see this glorious eschatology kind of break through once again in the new heavenly Jerusalem and us coming to Mount Zion and so on and so forth. Anyways, Hebrews is very valuable in resting assured during our unsure times. Okay, so, and what I mean by that is we cannot interpret a biblical doctrine through unbiblical means, right? And what I mean by that is we can't interpret an unbiblical doctrine through the subjective lens of societal changes, political maneuvering, general health of the populace, etc., etc., etc. And if we do that, Israel became a state in 1948. That's miraculous. Well, I think if you looked at all the political maneuvering that happened then, it's not too miraculous. There's a lot of reasons Israel is there now. But not even that. If you are formulating your doctrine based on anything other than the Scriptures, if you're formulating doctrinal or biblical doctrine based on anything other than the Scriptures, you're doing it wrong. That's called eisegesis. That's not exegesis. That's not biblical interpretation. That's your own subjective interpretation based on your interpretation of society, and then you're imposing that interpretation of society over the biblical text. And I think what we learn here in Hebrews 1 and 2 is that we are in the last days. We have been in the last days since the advent of Christ, since the first coming of the Lord Jesus Christ. It can't get more explicit than what it does in verse 2. I mean, he even uses the right word, right? Has in these eschatos, has in this eschatos spoken to us by his Son. Now, it's actually the eschaton, because in the genitive it's plural, and it's anyway. We cannot interpret eschatology through the subjective lens of politics, of CNN, MSNBC, CBS, Fox News, etc., etc. All that said, we need to understand that there is a relevance to what goes on in our world, right? It's not totally irrelevant. God works all things together for the good of those who love him. So it's not as if, like, this whole COVID-19 and government overreach and collapse of the economy is totally futile and useless. No, God is in his providence governing all of it. And so we need to understand that there's a significance, not write it off or relegate it to non-importance. It is very important. It's an opportunity to grow in the knowledge and wisdom of Christ. It's an opportunity to love our neighbors. It's an opportunity to zealously await the return of Christ, because Christ is coming back and we won't know the day or the hour. So we just need to focus on the main things, right? Not calculating the minute or the hour Christ returns, where we've already been told that we're not going to be able to know that. So what we need to be focusing on is how to grow in the Lord Jesus Christ, how to mature as Christians, as the church, and how to put to death the deeds of the flesh in preparation for the coming of the King, that we would be made ready for him. Okay, that's the goal of the Christian right now. And if I could just shift your attention off of, trying to ask eschatological questions based on what's going on in the news, to what the scriptures have mandated us to do as Christians, and that's to kill our sin as we love God and love our neighbors with the love of Christ, right? So anyways, if you guys appreciated this video, if it was edifying, please give me a thumbs up. If not, give me a thumbs down. Let me know why. Also, give it a share on social media. Also, if you haven't already, please subscribe and click the bell for continued notifications. God bless you guys. Have a wonderful rest of your day.